My name is Don Parkinson, and I'm a consultation specialist with S&C Lavalin. Today, we are continuing our series of live stream topics as our project moves through consultation round 2 of the environmental assessment phase. The topics we are covering parallel our project activities, so we hope these will help our viewers and listeners better understand the project and provide input along the way. So let's get started. Today we're going to talk about the proposed criteria and indicators for the evaluation of alternatives for supporting infrastructure. And all of this is to help community members understand the thinking behind and activities associated with the process. So let's get started. And I'll start by reviewing today's topics. We're going to start off as we usually do with a bit of a project background, followed by a discussion of the alternatives assessment process, which is important to understand before we talk about today's topic, which is proposed criteria and indicators for the evaluation of alternatives for supportive infrastructure. And then we're going to appeal to you to provide us some input on the project after that. So let's now move to the location of the project. Webequie First Nation itself is about 250 kilometers from both Hudson Bay and James Bay in northwestern Ontario. And the purpose of the Webequie Supply Road, there's actually multiple purposes for the road. The first is to move materials, supplies, and people from the Webequie Airport to the McFalds Lake area. The second is to provide employment and economic development opportunities to Webequie while allowing them to preserve their language and culture. And then finally, to provide experience and training opportunities for youth to help encourage the pursuit of additional skills through post-secondary education. In terms of the project itself, I always say that it's more than just a two-lane gravel road. There's much more to it. So it's actually the planned road is 107 kilometers in length. As I mentioned before, running from the airport at Webequie First Nation to the McFalds Lake area on the east side of Muckatai River. 17 of the 107 kilometers sit within Webequie First Nation reserve lands. The preliminary corridor width is 2 kilometers, so that's the width within which the road would go. And now we're in the process of identifying a preferred route or more exact location for the road within that preferred corridor. And the actual final corridor width or cleared area will be 35 meters. This is what you also call the right-of-way for the road. Continuing on with the project description, the planned road will have 3 major water body crossings. The first, as we move from Webequie, will be across Winisk Lake. That's the longest crossing of between 200 and 250 meters. The next one is to the south of the Winisk Lake crossing at Winiskis's Channel, and that's, I think, 30 to 40 meters in width. And then the final major crossing is at the extreme east end of the planned road across the Muckatai River, which is again similar in length to the Winiskis's Channel crossing, about 30 to 40 meters is the crossing. The project itself, as I mentioned, is not just a 2-lane gravel road, but it also includes both temporary and permanent aggregate or pit and rock quarry areas with equipment for processing or crushing the rock, as well as the access roads to get to these areas. And we'll get into that a little bit later on in more detail. Also included are temporary construction camps. These construction camps would accommodate construction crews and then also would include operations and maintenance offices, then it would become permanent in in one location, perhaps two, and then these permanent facilities that for operations and maintenance would include like a wastewater treatment plant or drinking water storage areas as well too. And then typically associated with these construction camps are storage and laydown areas for equipment and materials as well. So let's move now into the alternatives assessment process. Uh, so for every undertaking, which is, and I'm using the terminology that's used by in the provincial environmental assessment process, undertaking is, for all intents and purposes, a project. A reasonable range of alternatives must be considered during an environmental assessment. So alternatives include both alternatives to and alternative methods. So when we talk about alternatives to, we're talking about, so alternatives to the proposed undertaking or project are what you call functionally different ways of approaching and dealing with a problem or an opportunity. Meanwhile, alternative methods of carrying out a proposed undertaking or project are different ways of doing the same activity. So let's look at examples here to help everyone sort of understand this a little bit better. So when we talk about alternatives to the proposed undertaking, again, these are functionally different ways of approaching and dealing with a problem or opportunity. So those might be using a different mode of transport, maybe rail, maybe cargo hovercraft or cargo airship, some other way of other means of transportation. If there were an existing trail, this could be converted to a seasonal winter road as an option, perhaps. You could manage traffic demand so as to not have a need for an all-season road. You could also do nothing, or you could proceed with the project as Webequie has decided to do, to build a new all-season road. Let's now look at alternative methods. Alternative methods of carrying out a proposed undertaking are different ways of doing the same activity. So in our case, what they would be is different routes. So we have three route alternatives labeled 1, 2, and 3 right now within the preferred corridor for so that 2 kilometer wide band that I've talked about earlier. So within that 2 kilometer wide area, stretching from the airport at Webequie First Nation to the McFalls Lake area, we have three different alternative route locations, so positions for the road identified. Let's move now to talk about the main subject for today's show, and that's the proposed criteria and indicators for the evaluation of alternatives for supportive infrastructure. So there's two different things we want to look at with this. So as with identifying a route for the road, there's a lot of criteria and indicators for identifying, you know, the route for the road. A lot of things to consider and study. And some of these criterion indicators are geology, terrain and soils, surface water, groundwater, air quality, climate change, noise, vegetation and wetlands, fish and fish habitat, wildlife, archaeological resources, built heritage, cultural heritage resources, socioeconomic environment, indigenous land and resource use, aboriginal treaty rights and interests, visual environment, human health. There are many criteria and indicators for evaluating um, infrastructure alternatives as well as um, well, for evaluating supporting infrastructure alternatives. And there are also specific ones for each type of supporting infrastructure, and I'll get into that in a minute as well. But before we do that, what I thought I would do is look at some examples to help illustrate the kinds of considerations um, when it comes to proposed criteria and indicators. So let's look at the next slide, which is proposed criteria and indicators, air, noise, and soils. So for example, let's look at atmospheric environment, so air. What we might look at in that case is qualitative, so descriptive, and quantitative, measurable in terms of measurable with as a number, assessment of changes. So you might look at, for example, um, any potential changes in air quality, or so, for example, something like carbon monoxide, which is um, uh, from exhaust generated from vehicle traffic, for example. Has the concentration, has the amount of carbon monoxide in a given uh, volume of air changed over time? So that's a way, that's an indicator, that's a way of measuring impacts on air quality. You could also look at greenhouse gas emissions. So carbon dioxide, methane, or nitrous oxide as well too. And then if we were to look at the acoustic environment, you could look at noise. Uh, so look at sound level changes, whether they're absolute sound level changes or changes in levels as a result of the project. So that would be quantitative, so measurable changes in sound levels. You know, before, during, and you know, before construction, during construction, and after construction. You could also look at vibration too. That's all part of the acoustic environment discussion, and looking at potential construction vibration levels from heavy use of heavy machinery, from blasting at the quarry sites to be able to free the rock so that it can be processed and crushed to be used as road base as well. And then when you're looking at geology, terrain, and soils, you could look at changes in terrain quality. So the terrain is the type of land, or soil quality, any impacts on soil, or changes to permafrost, or topography, which is the height of land as well. So that's just air, noise, and soils, but there's many other proposed criteria and indicators. And we'll now move to water to talk a little bit about that. And so if we look at surface water, for example, you could look at the number of water bodies that are crossed by the planned road. You could look at changes to physical surface water levels. So does it cause does the construction of the road, or could the construction of the road cause upstream flooding? Um, have there been impacts or will there be impacts, or have there been impacts to water quality? Um, in other words, the chemistry of the water, has it changed negatively? You're getting higher concentrations of bad chemicals compared to before. You could look at changes to surface water quantity. Has it impacted water on the other side of the road, for example? Have water flow rates been impacted? Have flow patterns been impacted? Is the water flowing differently over the land than previously as a result of the road? Um, the volume of water, is there now more water as a result of the road? So these are indicators, these are ways to measure impacts. And then we look at groundwater. Um, you could be looking at, so groundwater is like spring water, so underground water. You could be looking at changes to groundwater flow patterns, or seasonal changes in flow patterns or levels of groundwater as well. Changes to the chemistry, physical or the physical aspects, or the chemistry of groundwater as well. Changes to the quantity of groundwater. Um, uh, so there's a lot of different ways to measure impacts when it comes to groundwater. Let's move now to vegetation. And when we talk about vegetation, there's many different uh, ecosystems we could talk about upland, riparian, wetland, all kinds of different ecosystems, and for each of those we could talk about changes to those, or and that's where the indicators would fit in. So, for example, when you're talking about, let's say, upland ecosystems, so ecosystems that are at slightly higher elevations, further away from water courses or water bodies, you could look at change, removal, or degradation, or like negative impact on on the quantity or availability or quality of vegetation, changes to um, the occurrence of non-native or native species. So the non-native would be for like invasive species of plants. Um, Fire potential maybe increasing, or as a result of potentially, because the vegetation types might change. When you're talking about wetland ecosystems, the wetlands could function differently, so you have to look for changes in wetland function, changes to the classes of vegetation, the species diversity, so the different number of species. Has it increased? Has it decreased? What has been the impact? And then connectivity. So connectivity is an important concept when it comes to vegetation, because it allows for continuous habitat, which is important to many different species, including birds. So there's a lot of criteria and indicators associated with vegetation. Let's move now to talk a bit about proposed criteria and indicators for fish and fish habitats. So there are certain species that community members um, often harvest, such as walleye, such as sturgeon, where it's available, um, pickerel, perch as well, and then for those different criteria, the types of indicators that you might have could be changes to habitat available to fish. So that could be the quantity of habitat, how much habitat is available, or the quality of it, how how um, useful that habitat is to different fish species. The number of water bodies crossed is another important indicator as well too. The number or area of water bodies crossed that include known or assumed critical habitats, such as spawning areas or nursery areas where the younger fish are are brought up essentially. And then, we're talking about each specific species, particularly the ones that are most important to community members. You could be talking about changes to the abundance and distribution um, of that species. So you could be looking at population, you could be looking at survival rates, reproduction, movement of that particular species as well too. So geographic distribution of that species. Next, we're going to move on to another key set of criteria and indicators, and that's related to what we call ATRI, which is Aboriginal and Treaty Rights and Interests. So when we're looking at that, we could be looking at, for example, Indigenous current and historical use of lands and resources for traditional purposes. So that would be the one of the criteria. And then the indicators for that, or the ways of measuring impact to that criterion, would be changes to availability of lands and resources for traditional purposes, for example, loss of or change to sites and areas used for traditional activities such as hunting or trapping or fishing. So these are ways of measuring impacts to that particular criterion of Indigenous current and historical use of lands and resources. Another criterion could be Indigenous relationships to traditional lands and resources. So in terms of indicators for that, you could have location, number, and type uh, of cultural, what you call keystone species, key species affected, changes. And then another one, which is people don't often think about, but there could be changes to the experience of being in a particular place, of importance in being on the land. So the sensory side of things, where if it's not the same experience as before as a result of a project being built. So that's another example as well. And let's have a look now at the social related proposed criteria and indicators. And some of these might be population and demographics, where the indicators might be changes in population or changes in subgroups of population. So women, men, youth, all that kind of stuff. And then housing and accommodation. The demand for permanent and or temporary housing, um, changes to the number of people living in a home, the supply of housing, the number of new housing starts and completions, quality of housing as well too. Again, these are more measures or indicators related to the criterion of housing and accommodation. You could also look at social and infrastructure services, where you could the indicators might be demand for community services and or infrastructure, or the supply and capacity of community services and or infrastructure to meet that demand as well. And then another extremely important criterion indicator would be human health. So when we look at human health, we could be talking about physical health, mental health, behaviors or substance abuse, health behaviors, exercise, health behaviors, recreational activity, healthcare access and quality, dental care access, diet and country foods, physical and environmental factors influencing health. So there's a lot of different criteria associated with human health. Let's take uh, let's say health behaviors, substance abuse, for example. The indicators for that might be changes to smoking and or vaping rates, changes to rates of alcohol abuse, changes to abuse of drugs. If we looked at maybe let's say recreational activity, changes to outdoor recreational activities, um, changes to outdoor spaces, changes to the amount of time spent on recreational activities, changes to the types of outdoor recreational activities as well too. So um, there's a lot of indicators associated with human health and criteria as well too. So next we're going to talk very briefly about the 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 criterion indicators that are very specific to the types of infrastructure, supporting infrastructure. So before we talked about the general proposed or criterion indicators that would apply to both the road and supporting infrastructure as well. But these particular ones are specific to the supporting infrastructure. So when we think of something like uh, uh, pits and quarries, for example, um, some of the key criterion indicators would be uh, the volume and quality of aggregate and rock sources. So, is there sufficient rock to feasibly help support the project? Is there aggregate available? Is there smaller stone available that could be accessed to build the road, or would bedrock have to be excavated or used and processed to create a road base of sufficient that meets specific project requirements. And then, when you think of a place like a pit or quarry, they're not always right beside where the planned road is. So an access road is required. So that access road has to go through the same kind of evaluation as would any other road, where you would look at how many watercourses are crossed, the length of the road, because the length of the road is the footprint, of the road. So the longer it is, the more of an environmental footprint it might have. So you would you would do an assessment, and we've done the same thing of the access roads. You might have multiple routes to access a particular location where you have aggregate or rock available. So those are more specific to supporting infrastructure. So that wraps up today's show. I do want to say that we want to hear from you, and we would really like very much to visit your community as well too. So please, get in contact with us. We would love to, as I mentioned, love to come and visit and talk to you more about the project and listen to any comments or questions uh, that that you may have about the project. So when we will, of course, follow your consultation protocols as well once you share them with us. And so we look forward to that hopefully very soon. And again, that wraps up today's discussion of alternatives for supportive infrastructure. We hope it was helpful and encourages you to join us again in 2 weeks. Don't forget to keep in touch with our project team members via the contact information available on our website, supplyroad.ca. We have a lot of information available on that website that's been compiled over the years. We record all of these and make these presentations available as well too. So miigwech, and we will talk to you again in 2 weeks when we continue our discussion of topics related to the Webequie Supply Road project. See you soon.